The horses would not go past the tree line. Elena Voss stood in the mud with the reins clutched in her fists, and no matter how she pulled, the animals refused to step one hoof closer to the black gates rising out of the fog ahead. The driver, an old man named Edmund who had guided her cart for 3 days, would not even look at the gates. He kept his eyes on the ground and his hand on the charm around his neck. "This is as far as I go," he said. "Past this point is his land." "Whose land?" Edmund flinched at the question, as though saying the name out loud might summon something out of the trees. "The Alpha King," he whispered. "Draven Blackthorn. No woman has ever walked into that fortress and walked back out again. 3 brides went in over the years. Not one came home." Elena's fingers tightened around the small wooden case she carried, the one holding the healing herbs her village had gathered as tribute. Her stomach turned, but she kept her spine straight, because someone from her village had to make this journey, and this year, that someone was her. "I have no choice," she said. "If the tribute isn't delivered, the pack will cut off our trade route, and my people will starve through the winter. I am not here as a bride. I am here as a healer's apprentice with a box of herbs." Edmund shook his head slowly, refusing to meet her eyes. "It does not matter why you go in. It only matters that you are a woman, and he is a monster who cannot be near one without something breaking." He would go no further. Elena climbed down from the cart alone, gathered her skirts against the cold wind, and began walking the last stretch of road on foot, the wooden case held tight against her chest like a shield. The fortress of the Blackthorn Park rose out of the mist like a mountain built by giants, black stones stacked so high that the top disappeared into the clouds. 2 guards stood at the gate, wolves in human shape, their eyes glinting gold even in the fading light. They did not smile when they saw her coming. "State your business," one of them said, his voice low and rough. "I carry medicine and herbs from the border village of Ashwell, sent as tribute to the park," Elena answered, keeping her voice steady even though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am Elena Voss, apprentice to the healer Nora Fenwick." The guards exchanged a look. One of them disappeared through the gate without a word, leaving Elena standing alone with the other, the wind biting at her cheeks, the fog curling around her ankles like something alive. She counted her breaths to keep from shaking. She had heard the stories her whole life, whispered around fires late at night, about a king so dangerous that his own court feared to bring a woman into his presence. Some said his wolf had a taste for the fragile pulse of human blood. Some said he had killed each bride with his bare hands the moment she was left alone with him. Some said worse. None of the stories agreed on how the women died. Only that they never survived him. The gate guard returned, and behind him walked a tall man with dark red hair and a scar across one eyebrow, dressed in the deep green of a captain's uniform. He studied Elena with sharp, careful eyes, as though trying to decide whether she was foolish or brave. "You are the healer's girl," he said. It was not a question. I am Captain Rurik. I serve the king." He looked past her toward the empty road, toward the cart she had left behind. "You came alone." "My driver would not cross the tree line." Something flickered across Rurik's face, something that looked almost like sympathy, though it vanished as quickly as it came. "Wise man. Come. The tribute must be recorded and the king informed of the delivery. It is custom." Elena's stomach dropped. "The king himself. He inspects all tribute personally. It will not take long. You will be back on the road before dark, if the weather holds." She did not believe him, not fully, but there was nothing to do except follow. The gates groaned open, and she stepped through them into a courtyard of black stone and torches burning blue-white against the dusk. Wolves in human shape watched her pass from the shadows of the walls, their eyes tracking her every step, and none of them spoke, as though speaking near her was somehow forbidden. The air itself felt heavier here, thick with a kind of tension Elena had never felt before, like the moment before a storm breaks. They climbed a long staircase and passed through halls hung with old banners bearing a wolf's head crest, until they reached 2 massive doors carved with the same symbol, guarded by 2 more silent wolves. Rurik pushed the doors open, and Elena stepped into a throne room lit by firelight, where a man sat waiting at the far end. He was larger than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to fill the space around him, and hair as black as the stone walls. He wore no crown, no ornament of rank, only dark clothing that looked worn from use rather than ceremony. When he lifted his head and looked at her, Elena felt the breath catch in her throat. His eyes were gold, brighter than any candle flame, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made it impossible to do so at the same time. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply looked at her the way a man might look at something he had not expected to see and did not yet know what to make of. Elena forced her legs to carry her forward until she stood before the throne, and she bowed her head the way Nora had taught her, the way custom demanded. "My king," she said, and her voice barely shook at all, which she counted as a small victory. "I bring tribute from the village of Ashwell. Herbs for the healers of your pack, gathered and prepared with care." She held out the wooden case. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched so long that Elena's arms began to ache from holding the case steady, and somewhere behind her she heard Rurik shift his weight, as though bracing for something. Then the king rose from his throne. He was even taller standing, and when he moved down the steps toward her, every wolf in the room seemed to hold its breath along with her. He stopped an arm's length away and looked down at the case in her hands, then at her face, studying her the way one might study a puzzle with a missing piece. "You are not afraid," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like stone grinding against stone, but there was something underneath it that was not cruel at all. "I am afraid," Elena admitted, because lying to a king seemed like a poor way to begin. "I am simply trying not to show it." Something shifted in his golden eyes, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. He reached out and took the case from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and Elena braced herself for whatever the stories had promised her. Pain. Violence. The end of everything. Nothing came. He simply held the case, turned it over once in his large hands, and looked back at her. "You will not return to Ashwell tonight," he said. Elena's heart leapt. "My king, I only came to deliver the tribute. I have no wish to trouble your household further. The mountain roads are dangerous after dark, even for a healer's apprentice." His tone left no room for argument, though it was not unkind either. "You will be given a room in the castle and sent home safely at first light." Behind her, she heard the faint intake of breath from more than one wolf in the room, and she understood, even without knowing exactly why, that something unusual was happening. Rurik stepped forward and murmured something to a servant, who hurried off to prepare quarters, and Elena stood frozen in place as the king turned and walked back toward his throne without another word, the wooden case of herbs still held carefully in his hands, as though it were something worth protecting. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed within the walls of the fortress everyone had warned her never to enter, Elena stared at the stone ceiling above her and tried to understand what she had witnessed. The king, who supposedly could not be trusted near a woman, had looked at her with something that was not hunger and was not rage. He had looked at her the way a starving man might look at food he was afraid to touch. Down the hall, she heard two guards whispering, their voices carrying faintly through the old stone. "He let her stay," one of them said, disbelief thick in his voice. "In 10 years, he has never let a woman stay." "Maybe this one is different," the other answered. Elena closed her eyes, her heart still racing, and wondered, for the first time since walking through those gates, whether the stories the villagers told around their fires had gotten the whole truth wrong. Morning came grey and cold, but Elena did not leave at first light as the king had promised. She woke to the sound of a servant knocking on her door, a young woman with kind eyes and a nervous manner, who introduced herself as Mia and explained, in a rush of words, that the king had requested Elena remain in the castle a little longer. Requested how? Elena asked, sitting up in the unfamiliar bed, still half convinced she was dreaming. "He said your knowledge of herbs might be useful," Mia said, though something in the way she avoided Elena's eyes suggested there was more to the story than that. "Captain Rurik will explain. Please, come with me. And do not be afraid. I know what they say about this place, but I have served here 5 years, and nothing has ever happened to me." Elena dressed quickly and followed Mia through the winding stone corridors, past windows that looked out over a valley wrapped in morning fog, until they reached a small study where Captain Rurik waited, along with an older woman holding a tray of bandages and salves. "The king was injured many years ago," Rurik said without preamble, in a fight that nearly cost him his life. The wound never healed properly. Our own healers have done what they can, but the pain remains, and it worsens as the years pass. Your mistress, Nora Fenwick, is known even here for her skill with old wounds and stubborn pain. We hoped you might share some of what she has taught you. Elena blinked, caught off guard. You want me to treat the king? I want you to try, Rurik said. No one else has been trusted with this task in a very long time. The older woman with the tray, who introduced herself as Beatrice, the castle's senior healer, studied Elena with an expression somewhere between hope and suspicion. I have kept him alive this long, she said, but I am old, and my hands are not what they once were. If you know something I do not, I would rather swallow my pride than watch him suffer. Elena thought of the stories again, the warnings, the vanished brides, and yet none of what she had seen so far matched the monster the villagers described. She thought of the way the king had looked at the case of herbs, turning it over gently in his hands, as though gentleness were not foreign to him at all. I will try, she said. They led her to a private chamber deep in the castle, far from the throne room, where the king sat shirtless on the edge of a wide bed, his back to the door. Even from behind, Elena could see the wound Rurik had spoken of, a long, jagged scar running from his shoulder down across his ribs, the skin around it darkened and warped in a way that told her the injury had never healed the way it should have. Beatrice's salves had done what they could, but the wound beneath them was deeper than skin. My king, Rurik said quietly. The healer's apprentice has agreed to examine your wound. Draven turned his head slightly, and when his golden eyes found Elena standing in the doorway, something in his expression tightened, as though he were bracing himself for pain that had nothing to do with his body. You do not have to do this, he said to her, his voice low. I want to, Elena answered, surprising herself with how true it felt. If I can help, I would like to try. He did not argue further. Elena crossed the room, set down her case of instruments, and knelt beside him to examine the wound more closely. Up close, she could see things Beatrice's reports had not captured, the way the scar tissue pulled tight in a pattern that did not match a simple claw wound, the strange discoloration threading through the skin like ink dropped in water. This was not only an injury, Elena said slowly, running her fingers gently along the edge of the scar. There is something else here. Something that feels almost like a curse mark. The room went very still. Rurik and Beatrice exchanged a look, and Draven's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It was Rurik, finally, who spoke. You should know the truth, he said, if you intend to keep helping him. What the villagers tell you, what the whole kingdom believes, is not what actually happened. Elena sat back on her heels and waited. 10 years ago, Rurik continued, the king was set to marry the daughter of a neighboring pack, a match meant to end years of conflict between our territories. But the girl's mother, a witch named Mograine, did not want peace. She wanted her daughter to inherit both territories through conquest, not marriage. When the alliance could not be broken by ordinary means, she placed a curse on Draven instead. What kind of curse? Elena asked. One that turns his wolf fairer, Rurik said. Whenever he grows close to someone he might come to love. The closer his heart draws to a woman, the less control he has over the beast inside him. It is not hunger for blood that has taken the 3 women who came before you. It is fear, spreading through the pack, of what might happen if his control slips even once. Each of those women left this castle unharmed, sent away the moment the danger became clear, but no one ever told the truth of why, because admitting a curse existed would have meant admitting weakness to every rival pack watching for a chance to strike. Elena turned to look at Draven, who sat with his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists on his knees, as though hearing the story spoken aloud was its own kind of wound. So you sent them away, she said quietly, to protect them. Not because you wanted to hurt them. I have never hurt anyone I meant to keep safe, Draven said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, a small fracture in the wall he had built around himself for 10 long years. But I could not be certain that would stay true if I allowed myself to care for someone. So I stopped trying. It is easier to be feared than to risk becoming the thing everyone already believes I am. Something in Elena's chest ached at those words, a feeling she did not have a name for yet. She looked back at the scar beneath her fingers, at the strange dark lines woven through the old wound, and thought of every fireside story she had grown up believing, every warning that had followed her the whole journey here. "The curse is tied to this wound," she said. "I am certain of it. If I can understand how it was placed, perhaps I can find a way to weaken it." "Others have tried," Beatrice said gently. "Which is far more skilled than a village apprentice." "Then I may fail," Elena admitted. "But I would still like to try, if the king will allow it." Draven lifted his head and looked at her for a long moment, gold eyes searching her face for something Elena could not quite name. Whatever he found there seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders, just slightly, like a held breath finally released. "You are the first person in 10 years, he said quietly, "who has looked at me and seen a man worth saving instead of a monster worth fearing. I do not know what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything with it," Elena said. "Just let me help." Over the following days, Elena returned to that chamber each morning, walking slowly through Nora's old remedies and her own careful observations, treating the physical wound while studying the strange dark pattern beneath it. She learned that certain herbs, when brewed a particular way, seemed to dull the ache of the curse mark itself, not just the pain of the old injury. She learned that Draven's temper, which the castle staff clearly still feared, was in truth remarkably patient, that he answered her questions honestly even when the answers embarrassed him, that he made small, dry jokes when he thought she was too focused on her work to notice, and that his laughter, when she finally coaxed it out of him one afternoon, was warm in a way nothing about the fortress or the stories had prepared her for. She learned, too, that the rest of the court watched her with growing disbelief. Guards who had once refused to look at her now nodded when she passed. Mia brought her tea each morning with genuine warmth rather than nervous duty. Even Beatrice, who had guarded her position as the king's healer for years, began asking Elena's opinion on his care rather than simply tolerating her presence. "They said no woman could survive near him," Rurik said one evening, finding Elena in the castle library poring over old texts about curses and bloodlines. "You have been here nearly 2 weeks. Perhaps the stories were never about survival at all," Elena said, not looking up from her book. "Perhaps they were about fear, and fear does not always tell the truth." Rurik studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. "Be careful, healer's apprentice. A curse built on fear does not release its hold easily, no matter how brave the person trying to break it." Elena thought of Draven's gold eyes, the crack in his voice when he admitted he did not know what to do with someone who saw him as worth saving, and she understood, with a small shiver, that Rurik's warning was not only about magic. 3 weeks passed, though Elena had long since lost count of the days in any careful way. What she noticed instead was smaller and stranger, the way the castle no longer felt like a place built of warnings, the way she woke each morning already thinking of the questions she wanted to ask Draven, the way he had started waiting for her by the window of his chamber before her knock ever came, as though he too counted the hours differently now. She had made progress on the curse mark, slow and uncertain, brewing tinctures that eased its grip a little more each week, though she was honest with him about how far they still had to go. "It is not gone," she told him one evening, sitting across from him at the long table in his private study, a fire crackling in the hearth and casting warm light across old maps and books. "But it is weaker than it was. I believe the curse feeds on isolation, on keeping you far from anyone who might care for you. The more you let people close, the more it seems to struggle to hold on. And if I let someone too close," Draven said quietly, "what happens then?" Elena knew what he was really asking, and she did not look away from his gaze. "I do not know. No one has tried it since the curse was cast. Perhaps the wolf breaks free entirely. Perhaps the bond that grows between two people is strong enough to hold him back. That is a great deal of uncertainty to build a life around." "It is," Elena agreed. "But you have already spent 10 years building a life around certainty, and it has cost you every chance at happiness. I am not telling you what to choose. I am only telling you what I believe to be true." Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his large hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. "No one has spoken to me this plainly in a very long time," he said finally. "Most people in this castle choose their words as carefully as they choose their steps, afraid of upsetting a king they believe might turn feral at any moment. I am not afraid of you," Elena said, and it was true, had been true since the very first night, though she still could not fully explain why. "I know," Driven said, and something in his voice made her chest tighten. That is precisely the problem, and precisely the reason I cannot seem to stop thinking about you. The words hung in the air between them, honest in a way neither of them had quite dared to be before. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly, the wind pressing against the windows outside. Driven, she said quietly, using his name instead of his title for the first time, testing the weight of it on her tongue. I am not afraid of what might happen if we let ourselves care for each other. I am only afraid of what might happen if we do not try, and you spend another 10 years alone because of a curse a bitter woman placed on you before I was even born. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted behind his golden eyes, some final wall coming down that he had spent a decade building brick by careful brick. He reached across the table and took her hand in his fingers large and warm and careful, as though he were still afraid of his own strength even now. If I hurt you, he said, I will never forgive myself. You will not hurt me, Elena said. I believe that with everything I have. For a moment, it seemed as though the fragile peace between them might grow into something neither of them had let themselves hope for. But that same night, as Elena walked the corridor back toward her own chamber, a low growl echoed from behind Draven's door, followed by the sound of something heavy striking the stone floor. She turned back immediately, heart pounding, and pushed the door open despite Rurik's shout of warning from further down the hall. What she found inside was not the man she had spent 3 weeks caring for. Draven knelt on the floor, his shoulders convulsing, dark fur already spreading across his arms, his golden eyes gone wide and wired, his breathing ragged and animal. The curse mark on his chest glowed faintly beneath his skin, dark lines pulsing like something alive and furious. Elena, get back, Rurik's voice came from the doorway behind her, tight with fear. This is exactly what we feared. He is losing control. But Elena did not step back. She remembered every hour she had spent at his side, every quiet conversation, every small piece of trust they had built between them, and she refused to believe that all of it could be undone by a single night. Draven, she said softly, stepping further into the room instead of away from it. I am here. I am not leaving. The half-shifted creature before her snarled, muscles curled tight, and for one terrifying moment Elena thought Rurik's fear might prove correct. Then golden eyes, still recognizably his own beneath the wildness, found her face, and the snarl faltered. Draven, she said again, kneeling down slowly until she was at his level, close enough that Rurik made a strangled sound of protest behind her. Look at me. You are not going to hurt me. I trust you completely. She reached out and laid her hand gently against his chest, right over the pulsing curse mark, and held it there, steady and warm, refusing to pull away even as his claws lengthened against the stone floor beside her. Slowly, impossibly, the wild light in his eyes began to dim. His shoulders shuddered, the dark fur receding back into skin, his breathing evening out from ragged animal panting into the deep, unsteady breaths of a man returning to himself. The glow beneath his skin faded until it was barely a shadow of what it had been, and finally, Draven slumped forward, exhausted, his forehead nearly touching Elena's shoulder. I am sorry, he whispered, his voice hoarse and human again. I am so sorry. I could feel myself slipping, and I could not stop it. But you did stop, Elena said, her hand still pressed against his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart slowly steady beneath her palm. You came back. Behind them, Rurik stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the two of them with an expression of pure disbelief, and further down the corridor, Elena could hear the hushed voices of servants and guards who had gathered at the sound of the commotion, now falling utterly silent at what they were witnessing. In 10 years, Rurik said quietly, almost to himself, I have never seen him come back from that on his own. He did not do it alone, Elena said, still kneeling beside Draven, her hand steady against his chest. None of us have to do the hardest things alone. That is the whole point. By morning, the story had spread through every corner of the castle, whispered between guards and servants with a note of wonder that had never accompanied the old warnings. The healer's apprentice had stood before the wolf and lived. More than that, she had called him back from the edge of losing himself entirely, simply by refusing to run. The whispers that followed her through the halls in the days after were different now, softer, filled with something like hope rather than fear, and for the first time since arriving at the Black Fortress everyone had warned her never to enter, Elena allowed herself to believe that the story she was living might end very differently than the one the villagers had told around their fires. The messenger arrived at dawn, breathless and pale, with news that spread through the fortress faster than fire through dry grass. A delegation from the neighboring territory had requested an audience under a banner of peace, asking to renew talks of alliance after 10 long years of silence between the two packs. Rurik did not trust it for a single moment. Peace, he said flatly, standing in the war room with Draven and Elena while maps of both territories lay spread across the table. After 10 years of nothing, they choose now to ask for peace. The same weak word has surely reached them that your cause is weakening. This is not diplomacy. This is Mograine testing whether her magic still holds. We cannot refuse an offer of peace without cause, Draven said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he agreed with every word Rurik had spoken. If we turn them away, we hand them a reason to claim we prefer conflict. We must receive them, and we must be careful. I want extra guards on Elena, Rurik said immediately. If the witch suspects her presence is undoing years of careful work, she may see her as the greater threat. Agreed, Draven said, and when he looked at Elena, the worry in his golden eyes was impossible to miss. I want you nowhere near this delegation without protection at your side. I understand, Elena said, though something cold had already settled in her stomach, a feeling she could not quite shake no matter how she tried to reason it away. The delegation arrived that evening, and a feast was arranged in the great hall to mark the occasion, long tables laden with food, musicians playing in the corners, the whole castle dressed in careful, watchful hospitality. At the center of the visiting party stood a woman with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes, introduced as Morgraine's envoy, though Elena noticed the way Rurik's hand never strayed far from the blade at his hip the entire evening. Elena stayed close to Draven's side through most of the feast, seated near enough to Rurik that she felt reasonably safe, and for a while, the evening passed without incident, filled with careful conversation and cautious toasts to renewed friendship between the two territories. It was during the confusion of the final course, when servants moved through the hall clearing dishes and musicians shifted into a livelier tune, that Elena excused herself briefly to step into the quieter hallway beyond the great hall, wanting a moment away from the noise and the weight of being watched. She never made it back. A hand closed over her mouth before she could cry out, and the last thing she registered before darkness took her was the sharp, cold scent of unfamiliar herbs and the whispered voice of a woman she had never met, speaking words in a language Elena did not understand. When Draven noticed her absence, it took only minutes to realize something was deeply wrong. Rurik found the servant girl, Mia, sobbing near the side entrance, having seen a cloaked figure carry something toward the tree line just beyond the castle walls. She is gone, Rurik said, finding Draven amid the chaos of the hall, guards already scrambling toward the gates. The envoy's party left in haste not long after the feast ended. I believe they have taken her. Something in Draven went very still, a stillness far more dangerous than any rage Elena had ever witnessed in him. Where? Toward the northern pass, my king. Toward Morgraine's territory. Draven did not wait for guards to be assembled or horses to be saddled. He tore through the castle courtyard, shedding his composure and his clothing both, until the massive black wolf that emerged into the torchlight bore no resemblance to the careful, restrained man Elena had come to know over the past weeks. He was pure instinct now, pure fury, a creature the old stories had always warned about, except this time the danger was not aimed at an innocent woman standing before him. It was aimed entirely outward, toward whoever had dared to take her. Rurik and a dozen guards followed on horseback, struggling to keep pace as the great wolf tore through the forest faster than any mount could carry them, following a trail only he could sense, some thread of connection neither cost nor distance could fully sever. Elena woke to the smell of damp stone and the flicker of unfamiliar torchlight. She was bound loosely to a chair in what appeared to be an old watchtower, her wrists tied but not painfully so, and across the small room stood the silver-haired woman from the feast, no longer wearing the careful smile of diplomacy. You are more trouble than I expected, Mograine said, studying Elena with cold, assessing eyes. 10 years I spent weaving that curse into his blood, ensuring he would never again risk his heart on another living soul, and you undo it in a matter of weeks with nothing more than herbs and stubbornness. The curse was never as strong as you believed, Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. Cruelty rarely holds as tightly as people fear it does. Morgraine's expression darkened. We will see how strong your stubbornness proves once I finish what I started. If the healer cannot be reasoned with, perhaps she can simply be removed from the equation entirely. Outside, a sound rose through the night that made even Morgraine go pale, a deep, furious howl that seemed to shake the very stones of the tower. Moments later, the door to the watchtower splintered inward, and the massive black wolf that had once been driven Blackthorn stood in the wreckage, eyes blazing gold, every inch of him coiled with barely restrained violence. Morgraine raised her hands, muttering words meant to strengthen her hold over him, but Elena, bound to her chair, understood in that instant that the man she loved was standing at the very edge of losing himself completely, and that no magic in the world would matter if he crossed that line here, in this small stone tower, with her as the only witness. Driven, Elena called out, her voice cutting through the growls and the witch's murmured spellwork. Look at me. Not at her. At me. The great wolf's head turned, gold eyes finding her across the room, and for one suspended moment, the entire tower seemed to hold its breath. You told me you would come back, Elena said, steady despite the tremble in her hands. Come back to me now. Something in the wolf's stance shifted, the wildness in his eyes narrowing into focus, and with a final furious motion, he turned on Morgraine instead, forcing her back against the stone wall with nothing more than the sheer presence of his fury, until her spellwork faltered and broke entirely. Rurik and the guards arrived moments later, bursting through the ruined doorway to find Morgraine subdued and Elena still bound to her chair, shaken but unharmed, and Draven kneeling before her, already shifting back into his human shape, his hands trembling as he worked at the ropes around her wrists. I heard you, he said hoarsely, freeing her hands at last and pulling her carefully into his arms. Even lost in the wolf, I heard your voice, and it was the only thing that mattered. Elena held onto him tightly, her heart still racing from everything that had happened, and outside the broken tower door, she could hear Rurik giving orders to secure Morgraine and prepare for the ride home, the northern forest slowly quieting around them as the danger finally passed. You came for me, she said softly against his chest. I will always come for you, Draven answered, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Curse or no curse, I could not have stayed away even if I tried. The ride back to the fortress took the better part of a day, and Elena spent most of it wrapped in a heavy cloak Rurik had draped over her shoulders, seated in front of Draven on his horse, his arms steady around her the entire way. Neither of them spoke much, exhausted from the events of the previous night, but every so often his hand would tighten slightly around her waist, as though reassuring himself she was truly there, truly safe, truly real. When they arrived at the Black Gates, the entire castle seemed to be waiting, guards and servants alike gathered in the courtyard despite the early hour, word having spread ahead of them that the witch responsible for the 10-year curse had finally been captured. Beatrice rushed forward the moment Elena dismounted, insisting on examining her for any lingering effects of whatever Morgraine had used to subdue her, while Mia hovered nearby with tears of relief openly running down her face. I told everyone you would be found safe, Mia said, hugging Elena tightly despite Beatrice's protest about proper examination. I told them the king would not let anything happen to you. You were right, Elena said, managing a tired smile despite the ache in her limbs and the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. Draven insisted on carrying Morgraine's containment personally to the castle's deepest chamber, a place built specifically to hold those who practice dangerous magic, and it was Rurik who explained to Elena, once she had rested and eaten something warm, exactly what would happen next. She will face judgment before the full council, Rurik said, sitting across from Elena in the same study where she and Draven had shared so many quiet conversations over the past weeks. 10 years of secrecy about the curse can finally end. The truth of what happened to those 3 women who came before you will be told plainly, and Draven's name will be cleared of the suspicion that has followed him for a decade. And the curse itself? Elena asked. Is it truly broken? Rurik's expression softened into something Elena had rarely seen on the captain's usually guarded face. Come and see for yourself. She found Draven in his private chamber, standing before the same window where he had waited for her each morning over the past weeks, though something about the way he stood now was different, lighter somehow, as though a weight he had carried for 10 years had finally been set down. When he turned to look at her, the scar on his chest, the one that had held the curse mark for so long, was simply a scar now, pale and faded, with no trace of the dark pulsing lines that had once threaded through it. Beatrice examined it an hour ago, Draven said quietly. The mark is gone entirely. Whatever bound my wolf to fear and isolation broke the moment Mograin's spellwork failed in that tower. I am free of it, Elena. For the first time in 10 years, I am truly free. Elena crossed the room and took his hands in hers, feeling the steady warmth of him, the calm control that had replaced the wild desperation of the night before. You were never the monster they made you out to be, she said. I hope you can finally believe that now. I believe it, Draven said, because you believed it first, long before I had any reason to hope it might be true. That evening, the castle held a quiet celebration, nothing like the grand feast that had welcomed Mograin's first delegation, but something warmer and more genuine, filled with the relief of people who had lived for a decade under the shadow of fear finally allowed to breathe freely. Draven stood before his assembled court and told them the truth at last, the real story of the curse, the real reason for his isolation, the real fate of the women who had come before Elena, sent away unharmed rather than lost to violence as the rumors had always claimed. The court listened in stunned silence, and when he finished speaking, it was Rurik who stepped forward first, kneeling before his king in a gesture of renewed loyalty, followed by the rest of the guards and servants who had served him faithfully through years of whispered fear they had never fully understood. Later that night, long after the celebration had quieted and the castle had settled into peaceful sleep, Elena found herself once again in Draven's private chamber. The fire burned low and warm, the wind outside gentle rather than howling as it had been on so many nights before. I used to dread the nights most of all, Draven admitted, sitting beside her on the edge of his bed, his large hand resting over hers. The curse always felt strongest in the quiet hours, when there was nothing to distract me from 10 years of loneliness. I have not slept a full night through in longer than I can remember. Perhaps tonight will be different, Elena said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, gold eyes warm rather than wild, and something passed between them that needed no further words. She settled beside him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat, no longer racing with fear or restrained fury, simply steady and human and safe. Every story I ever heard about you told me I would not survive this moment, Elena murmured, already feeling sleep tugging gently at the edges of her mind. And yet here you are, Draven said quietly, his arm wrapping carefully around her, safe in my arms, exactly where I hope you will stay. Elena smiled against his chest, the last of her exhaustion finally giving way to genuine peace. The whole kingdom will hear of this by morning. The healer's apprentice who tamed the Alpha King, they will say. The woman who broke a curse no one else dared to touch. Let them say whatever they like, Draven murmured, already half asleep himself, his voice softer and more unguarded than Elena had ever heard it. I only care that the story ends the way it should have from the very beginning. Morning came bright and clear over the fortress that had once been whispered about only in warnings, and for the first time in 10 years, the Alpha King slept peacefully through the entire night, undisturbed by curse or fear or the weight of isolation he had carried for so long. Word of what had happened spread quickly beyond the castle walls, through villages that had once traded only out of necessity and fear, until even Ashwell heard the news carried by traveling merchants, that the Alpha King, once thought incapable of surviving a woman's presence without tragedy, had instead been saved by one, and that the healer's apprentice who made the dangerous journey to deliver simple tribute had returned not as a frightened messenger, but as the woman who would one day stand beside him as his equal and his queen. The old warning that had followed Elena through every mile of her journey to the Black Gates was finally, completely, rewritten. No woman had ever survived the Alpha King, the stories once claimed. But she had done more than survive him. She had seen the truth beneath 10 years of fear, stayed when every instinct told her to run, and in doing so, had given him back the one thing the curse had stolen from him longest, the simple, quiet peace of falling asleep without fear, safe in the arms of someone who had chosen, freely and completely, to stay.